Welcome. Welcome, everyone. This is yet another webinar in our 5th series of cross-cultural communication CCC webinars for interpreters, created, by the way, at the beginning of the pandemic to support interpreters everywhere. We're delighted to welcome you. I'm Marjorie Bancroft, your host and the founder and director of CCC. With us today, and this is really a special treat for us, is Michael Nemerich, who I want to award a medal to because he is speaking to us from Australia at 5:30 a.m. his time. Let us give him full credit for that. And he came on board looking so wide awake as if he'd been up for hours. Michael is speaking to us today about the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, which, as a number of you know, is Australia's national certification program that I wish we had here in the States because it's for general interpreting and translation. And not only that, they do 57 languages, which makes me salivate, with live role players. He's going to be talking to you all about that as a way of showing us a blueprint for what national certification, which in the United States here, we only have for American Sign Language interpreters, to show us what that looks like. And this from a gentleman who will introduce himself to you properly, but who is actually their national operations manager and deputy CEO, and who has worked also, and this really interests me, I hope he mentions it during his introduction, with First Nations people in Australia. So without further ado, I do want to mention a couple of important things. We have, in addition to our usual CUs for CCHI and RID and ATA, which will appear on your certificates, we also have Australian NAATI PDPs, professional development points, which is kind of exciting. It's the first time we've ever had that. In addition, yes, you will be getting a link tomorrow, about 24 hours from now, to your certificate, to the PowerPoint, which is graciously being shared, to the recording of this, and the recording can also be shared. Once it goes live on our website tomorrow, you can feel free to share the recording as well. For US attendees, though, I'm afraid you can only get the CUs if you have been attending this live. For chat, we encourage you, please, to use the chat to greet people, to ask questions, and our wonderful publications manager, Andrew Hall, and I will both be answering questions behind the scenes. But if it's questions for CCC or greetings to other interpreters or other people on, please use chat for that, for question and answer. That feature, if you would reserve that feature, please, for your questions for Michael, for our presenter. And I will be coming back at the end with at least 15 minutes to spare to ask him what I suspect will be some very interesting questions. We suggest that you use gallery view at that time when I come back, so you can see both presenters at the same time. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask and chat. Without further ado, Michael is going to introduce himself more thoroughly, but I want to let you know you will see me again for questions. So Michael, it's your show now. Take it away.
Thank you, Marjorie, for the glowing introduction. Let me put my presentation up. Hopefully that all shows up fine. So thank you so much for the invitation to present today. Hopefully everyone gets a little bit of something out of it. I am Michael Nemerich, the Manager of National Operations at NAATI. As Marjorie mentioned, prior to this, I've been with NAATI about 3.5 years now, but I did 13 years with First Nations Australians prior to that. And I guess my love of interpreting and the language industry sort of came from that as well, because where I worked, English was not the first language, and we used interpreters in a day-to-day setting for board meetings and the like. So super excited to be here and talk about our accreditation certification system in Australia, and maybe be able to collaborate with some of our international colleagues over time after this. So without further ado, today I'll go through who we are, what we do, a bit of our history, because I think it's important to set the scene of how we were set up and how we arrived to where we are today, which is the certification system, and then what we hope to achieve in the future, even though I think as the last couple of years of pandemic have shown us, there's not much that you can predict, but we've got a couple of solid things that we want to work on. So us, as introduced, we are the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters. No one knows us as that. We're always called NAATI. And since we moved to the certification system in 2018, the accreditation seems a bit out, but when you've been called the same thing for 45 years, you sort of stick with it. Now, our absolute vision, and this is what we work towards every day, is a connected community without language barriers. We are the national standards and certification body in Australia. We're the only ones that do certification within the country. And we believe that by setting and maintaining high national standards and advocating for the use of professional practitioners where they're needed, we'll be able to get to a position where people with low English proficiency will be able to maximise that participation in mainstream society. It's not a legal requirement to be NAATI certified to work within Australia. So we do a lot of work advocating and working with governments and businesses to say why standards are important, advocating for interpreting and translating as a skilled profession, no different than lawyers or doctors or teachers, and one that should be respected as such. So as of today, we have just over 13,000 practitioners with over 17,000 credentials in 182 languages. So our system, which we'll go through later in the slides, is from everything from languages that aren't tested to highly specialised legal and health and conference interpreter certifications. So the universality of our system is so that whenever a consumer, a low English proficiency person that requires it, or a doctor or a practitioner, sees the NAATI logo, that's their mark of quality, and they can be assured that the person they're using has the skills, knowledges and attributes that they require in that job and in that setting. So about us, it was established in 1977. We started off as one of the, as a part of the government department, the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs. Although we've been around since 77, there was really minimal substantive change up until 2018. And later in the slides, I'll go through what we call the Improvement to NAATI Testing project, which really set us on the course to where we are today. Often we're misunderstood as being a member organisation, but we're not. We're really consumer focused. So the setting of standards and the testing of practitioners and the lobbying in governments and businesses for their use is really about ensuring those that need interpreters and translators for language access, they get what they require. We believe from everything we know that we're quite unique in what we do, in the breadth and depth of languages and credentials that we offer, and the national nature of our system. And we're also unique in the type of company that we are. So in the early 80s, we moved out of the government department and we became an incorporated not-for-profit company, but our shareholders are the 9 governments of Australia, the federal government and the 8 state governments. So reasonably unique, and it's set us up to where we are. I should also mention at this point, although the government is shareholders of us, we are self-funded almost entirely. So over 90% of our revenues come from our own business activities. So for our history, and you'll see there is not many key milestones on these graphs. So as I said, it's formed in 77, and the impetus of our formation was a large post-World War II migration, largely from Southern Europe at the time, Greek and Italian. And we had a big immigration policy after being colonised in 1788. After the Second World War, there was a real need for large infrastructure projects, and migration moved largely from the UK, and we started opening up into Europe. So in 77, to accommodate all these workers that were flowing in for large infrastructure projects within the nation, NAATI was formed. In the early 80s, it was a formalised part of the accreditation system starting, the system that ran up until 77. But at the time, we also took on Aboriginal languages and sign languages. So we became a universal system from right back then in the early 80s. At time of colonisation, there was about 400 Aboriginal languages spoken in Australia. Unfortunately, today we're down to about 150 in use, but there's only 12 being used as a L1 every day by every age demographic. So that's really reduced over time. In the late 80s, we helped establish AUSIT, which is the Australian Institute of Interpreters and Translators, and that's the professional association for interpreters and translators within Australia, where we're the standards and certification body. So complementary, but different roles. In the 2000s, we did some structure reviews, but 2012 is the really key point, which is the improvement to NAATI testing project, which I'll go into in detail. It set us up to where we are today. We established the National Indigenous Language Interpreter Advisory Committee in 2015, the Technical Reference Advisory Committee in 2017. And both of those are on there because it shows NAATI's engagement with stakeholders and our willingness to learn and continue to improve so we meet the needs of Australian society. So the NILIAC and the TRAC both sit as advisory bodies. They meet quarterly, sometimes more regularly if there's a need that arises, and they help inform our board and the senior management of developments in the industry and to help us set policy and procedure. We also have regional advisory committees that are more grassroots, local level, working with language service providers, hospitals, police departments, etc., in those states, so we get direct feedback of how everything is working. And where we are today, which is the certification system. So the improvement to NAATI testing report, again, commissioned in 2012, it was prepared by Professor Sandra Hale of the University of New South Wales, but it did have 6 contributing authors from 5 additional universities as well. So it was a very comprehensive report, I think about over 130 pages by the end. And it involved thousands of practitioner surveys, dozens of meetings with government, stakeholders, language service providers, to really form how we would come up with the knowledge, skills and attributes that were required for certification in the country, but also to ensure acceptance and get the wide range of views of what was required by businesses, governments, etc. It was a big project. Report in 2013, wasn't until 2018 that we launched the certification scheme. So really comprehensive root and branch reform of how we did things and why we did it to ensure fair, valid and reliable testing for candidates and those standards. So some of the key changes that were introduced that we use today. In the accreditation system, anyone was able to apply for a test. They could just apply and sit, and the pass rate was woeful, to be honest, back in the accreditation system. And I'll probably mention this a couple of times through the slides, but even with 45 years now of NAATI's existence, there is still the bilingual equals interpreter that we have to constantly rebuff and advocate for it as a professional skill that it is. So the minimum training requirements is now at a diploma level, so just below a bachelor's degree. That's the minimum training requirements to even become eligible for a test. So this ensures that professional practice is learnt beyond what we can test on the day, so ethics, intercultural, but also knowledge of the skills of the profession, such as professional conduct, how to take notes well, interactional management. All of those can lead to better success in the test, but also better professional outcomes after certification. We introduced, I should add, that also helps support the more global infrastructure around the profession. So more universities teaching more languages can support and provide more interpreters. So having a minimum training requirement helps support the higher education system to continue to deliver on that training and make it viable. Another really big key change was we introduced live role players. And I'll talk about them a little bit more in a coming slide, but this was to present a more natural simulated environment. Right up until 2017, we were using pre-recorded consecutive tasks on tape. So we've come a long way in a very short period of time with that. We introduced rubrics for the marking system rather than the deductive marking system that we had in the past. And that's to ensure a more holistic assessment of the performance is done. We introduced recertification, which is the need to continuously prove currency for maintenance of the credential. And this was one of the big contentious issues when we introduced it. It's largely accepted now, but every 3 years, every practitioner to maintain their credential need to submit professional development evidence and work practice evidence. So the work practice evidence is roughly 40 hours a year for an interpreter, or 10,000 words translated a year for those that are translators. And the professional development is split into several categories. We have skills development and knowledge, which is business management, subject matter specific courses. If someone's a legal interpreter, for example, T&I best practice. We have language maintenance as a category, which includes subscription to magazines or membership of cultural associations, ensuring that people do ethics training constantly as well, and industry engagement such as mentoring new interpreters, membership of professional associations, or publishing articles or teaching in the profession. NAATI testing, which seems a bit funny for me to say that, but in the accreditation system, we actually accepted higher education institutions that taught the course, doing the test themselves, and then recommending to NAATI to award accreditation. So super big change for us to take all testing on board ourselves, but that change allowed us to eliminate any bias from an education institution of actually wanting to get their students through to the NAATI accreditation. You would hope that everyone was up front, but definitely there was some people in the accreditation system that got through primarily because their higher education institution wanted them to, not necessarily because they were the right person for it. We introduced a new category, which is specialist health and legal interpreting, which is a really high level certification for us. It was highlighted as a need from all the government and language service providers, and to even be eligible to sit a specialist health and legal test, candidates need to be already a certified interpreter, need to have been practicing for several years, and need to have formal qualifications in legal or health, such as a nursing degree or very specific professional development in that space. So very high end for it. We introduced revision task for translating. So the revision task has stayed relevant now with post-editing on machine translations, but revision is really that fundamental underpinning of why are you writing it the way you are. And we also moved to computerized translations because right up until 2017, we were still using paper and pen. So this is the scheme, this NAATI certification system as it stands today. So going from left to right in the lowest to the highest credentials, the pink boxes at the top talk about what the test type is. So recognised practicing interpreter and recognised practicing translator are credentials that we don't test in. And this is to ensure that we continue to be able to be a universal system. So for recognised practicing credentials, there's over 300 languages spoken in Australia and over 7,000 in the world. So we're never going to be able to do all of those languages. The way that we recognise them, though, is that by getting formal training and evidence of work practice, we will issue recognised practicing to those that want it. And by people signing up to recognised practicing, they're also signing up to the code of conduct that we have for all of our professional practitioners, but also the need to recertify and do professional development and ongoing work practice to maintain it. So we acknowledge that recognised practicing isn't as good as being able to test in the loop and the skills, but at least by ensuring that we've got formal education and that ongoing work practice and adherence to professional development and code of ethics, it's better than the alternative, which is just someone's word that they can do what they're saying they can do. The first entry-level certification test is Certified Provisional Interpreter. And I think in hindsight, if we had our time again, we would not use the word provisional in it, but it replaced what was in the accreditation system, paraprofessional interpreter. So provisional, there's nothing really provisional about it. This is a community interpreting test. It is a very high level still. And the CPI test consists of 3 15-minute live dialogues. 2 of them are face-to-face. 1 of them is over the telephone. So as mentioned prior, the use of live role players in this scenario allows for the testing of skills such as interactional management, the ability to ask for clarification, etc. So really critical part of our testing. We run about 700 CPI tests a year. And the numbers on these boxes, which I should have mentioned at the start, is the number of languages that we currently test or certify, credential in the case of recognised practicing. They're the numbers that we're currently doing at each level. So the next level up, certified interpreter, which is complex but non-specialised language. Where certified interpreter differs from CPI is there is 2 live dialogues, similar to the CPI dialogues, but they're more complex language and they're longer. They're about 17 to 20 minutes. And then we include the skills of sight translations. There's 2 of those, 1 in each direction. 2 consecutive monologues, and then 2 simultaneous monologues or chuchotage, whispered interpreting. The 6 tasks, so there's the 2 live dialogues in that, but the 6 other tasks are pre-recorded. Certified translator gets introduced at this level, complex and non-specialised. The certified translator test is 2 translations out of a choice of 3, and the revision task that I mentioned earlier. Now, you might wonder why there is a gap here, and the reason that there is a gap is in the old accreditation system, there was a paraprofessional translator, but part of the improvement to NAATI testing project was we came to the understanding that in translation, the work that you provide is either right or it's not. So there's not that opportunity to ask for additional information or ask for clarification. So we removed the provisional or paraprofessional translator and just introduced from translator on. And that number on that box is actually incorrect. It should be 37. And then the highest level of credentials, slightly different, specialist interpreter in health or specialist interpreter in legal. These are 2-part tests. There is a knowledge test, which is a combination of multiple choice and short answers. And then an interpreting test, which has 3 consecutive tasks and 1 is simultaneous. And then conference interpreter, which sits at the same level, but is obviously a specialised skill in and of itself. And the conference interpreter we do as directions, like we do with translator. So it's LOTE into English or English into LOTE. And that's one consecutive task and 2 simultaneous tasks. And that's highly specialised terminology. So next month, I believe that my colleague, Aurelie Sheen, she is presenting on the test types that we do, and we'll go into more detail on the knowledge, skills, tributes, how the rubrics work, and the like as well. So if you're interested in this presentation and want to know more, I'd urge you to log into that upcoming webinar. So tested languages. We've been, it's been a rapid rise over the life of certification. We've only been going 4 years. And by the end of this year, we'll be testing in 60 languages at the CPI level. 2 of those are signed, Australian Sign Language, which we call AUSTLAN, and deaf interpreting, so non-conventional sign. We have 12 Indigenous Australian languages and 46 international or migrant languages that we're testing in. So it's been a very rapid and busy couple of years. We've had to train over 800 role players and employ them since 2018 to be able to deliver on these tests. And we now work with well over 400 examiners to mark. So the examiners, every single test that we conduct is marked by a minimum of 2 examiners. They mark it independently and blindly of each other. And then whenever there is a disagreement between the 2 examiners in the final score on those rubrics, we instantly go to a third, and that happens in about 20 to 30% of cases, depending on test type. And then live role players, huge challenge for us, ensuring that we get the consistency to deliver high quality testing and ensure that only the candidate performance on the day is the indicator of their success, rather than the quality of the people that are the actors in the test itself. So even if there was only 1 candidate for the language tomorrow, we would still use 6 role players, 3 LOTE role players and 3 English role players to conduct the 3 tasks in that CPI test. We have to invest a considerable amount of time in recruitment, training and screening of the role players leading up to the test. But then also in the day before the test, we go through multiple rehearsals with rehearsal interpreters who simulate the role of the candidate. And that's just to ensure the consistency. So even the biggest languages, because there's 60 tested, we try and test everything at least twice a year. But even at twice a year, like a Somali role player will only get 2 times to work with us. So that's one of the real critical parts for us, is ensuring that ongoing training and development of role players to make sure that even if there's only a singular candidate being tested, they get the same consistent experience. And for tests delivered, we've got a lot on this graph, so I'll try to explain it a little bit. So very much you can see we had a very slow start in 2018 and rather inconsistent, but we've really invested a lot into both role players and our certification policy and development team to scale up what we can offer and how regularly we can offer it. COVID, no surprise to anyone, but hit us just like everyone else around the world. And that gap between April and June 2020 is when we stopped testing. We shut our venues due to public health advice. But there is some positive things that have come out of it. It really forced us to innovate even faster and more widely than we would have done otherwise. So up until March 2020, all of our translation tests were done on site with people bringing their own computers. All of our interpreting tests done on site as well. In July 2020, the majority of our states opened up, but one of our largest testing states, Victoria. Melbourne's got a population of around 6 million people. They went into a second round of lockdowns, and that really forced us to look at how and what we did. And we introduced Microsoft Teams as the way to do the live role play tasks at that space. And that's worked quite well. In that first year, people were reluctant and were often delaying and saying, "I'll wait until a face-to-face test comes on board." But now we've got candidates that are actually requesting online rather than the face-to-face version anyway. So we've released our test calendar out until the end of 2025 at the moment to give certainty to universities, higher education institutions, candidates and businesses of what we're doing and when we're doing it. And in every single test session, we will now offer an online variant. So international candidates, but also those that aren't near a major city in Australia can take advantage of and become a professional practitioner more easily. In September 2020, we introduced certified translator tests on a dedicated online platform. We've partnered with Televic, who's based in Europe, to develop that platform. And we now run all of our certified translator tests on that platform, about 1,000 a year. And that's given about 15% of our candidates now don't reside in Australia at all. So it's really opened up reach for that. It's allowed test venues to be freed up to test more in-person live tests, which has been fantastic as well. And we're finding with surveys to candidates that it's a less stressful environment when they can do it in their home as well. So we use pretty advanced proctoring software to ensure that there is no cheating. So we do screen recording, audio recording, and have a second camera set up in the room. People use their cell phone or mobile phone to scan the room at the same time as everything else is being recorded through their webcam and screen. So we're able to ensure the security, validity, and reliability of the test, but also be able to run them all around the world. So where we're headed to, there is a natural limit of our testing growth. These numbers are indicative, they will likely change, but at the moment we believe out till 2025 we should end up at about 70 CPI languages. So that's 10 more than we've got right now. And I mean, I won't read each of the other numbers on there, but the real limiting factor for us is, one, candidate demand. Is there enough people within Australia that would actually be able to take advantage of the test by having the training that they require and the size of the population that speaks the language as well? Definitely when it comes to certified interpreter, this is the case also. We've got a really rough rule of thumb in Australia, which is anything above about 50,000 people that speak that language other than English as their primary language in their home. That's about our cutoff for the certified interpreter. It's about 10,000 for certified provisional interpreter. But in addition to the candidates is whether we can get the examiners that would be required. So our examiners, highly trained, highly skilled professionals, as you'd expect. We expect at least 10 years in the industry working as a practitioner with NAATI certification or accreditation. But we also expect at least 5 years, preferably more, of setting and marking experience in academic institutions. So we're looking for the best of the best to be our examiners. And that in and of itself limits the growth that we can go from there. Conference interpreter, we're mainly aiming towards languages used in the United Nations and European Union. So that's limited by that. And specialist interpreter is again a candidate domain. So we do other things other than the certification testing. So we run, as mentioned, about 700 CPI tests a year. We run about 250 certified interpreter tests a year. Conference specialist tests sort of around in the dozens. And translator, we run around 1,000. So there's about 2,000 professional tests a year, but we do non-professional testing as well. And that's where the bulk of our revenue comes from, and it allows us to support the broader system for certification. And we have two types of non-professional tests. The first one is a community language aid test. And this is specifically aimed at businesses or government departments that use bilingual staff in the workplace to connect with customers. It's rated at CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, at B2, which is upper intermediate. It's about a 20-minute test, and it stays completely within the LOTE. We believe this test was only developed a few years ago. We've put a fair bit of development into it this year, and we see this as probably one of the biggest growth areas for NAATI over the coming years, because there's plenty of opportunities for business and government to connect with language other than English speaking consumers. But how do you ensure that that staff member can speak the languages you expect them to do based on their CV or resume? So we're doing about 500 tests a year in CLA. There's over 40 languages, and we see this as very complementary to the profession as well. We can't ignore that bilingual workers exist, but at least by inserting ourselves and putting some standards around it, we have specific ethics training for CLA candidates as well. It says, this is the role of a bilingual worker. This is where your boundaries start and stop, and this is when you should pass on to a professional practitioner to allow for the conversation to go on, particularly when you're seeking consent. No different than a first aid responder might be, gets tested and is used, but then you need doctors and specialists after that. Our biggest test type is called community credentialed language, and this is a bit of a quirk of the Australian environment, but we run about 18,000 tests a year in CCL, 58 languages. 50 of those correspond with what we do in certification, 8 are separate. But for migration into Australia, for 2 skilled visa subtypes, we run a points-based system in Australia. So the more points you get towards a visa, the more likely you are to be granted one. And the CCL test grants 5 points to skilled migrants that speak a language other than English competently enough to assist with their culturally and linguistically diverse communities that exist in Australia. So it's not a professional test. Those that pass it aren't interpreters, but it's the ability to help someone at the supermarket or the pharmacy get what they need and get around with basic, simple information. So that test is all online now. We used to run it in venues, but from January of last year, we pushed that onto our Televic platform. And that, again, freed up all of our test venues for more certification tests. But the CCL test, really important part of our business, but also great to keep engaged with our examiners who get more work because they are able to mark these tests in addition to the lower number of certification tests a year, and then gives us the scale to develop our administration and all our IT infrastructure and offices and the like. So almost at the end of the presentation. I know it's been pretty quick, but super happy to be on board and doing some Q&A soon. What we see is happening next. First one is international engagement, of which this webinar is part of that process. So we're really proud of what we do here in Australia. We're biased, but we think we've got a great little system that's got learnings for around the world. Starting in 2024, New Zealand has actually adopted us as their standard. So all government work that requires interpreting, not translating yet, from 2024 will require NAATI certification. So we're working closely with them to transition and get practitioners aware of the changes coming up and transition and test to be ready for that implementation. We're also becoming more engaged with international organisations around the world, trying to learn from each other, and raise the profile of the profession overall, because, again, biased, but interpreters and translators play such a critical role in society, and in many scenarios just aren't given the professional recognition that they deserve. So the more we can do within Australia and around the world to support the profession, the better it is for everyone. Our continuous improvement program has just commenced about 6 months ago, and orally in the upcoming webinar, my colleague will be able to give a couple more details on it. But now that we've got several thousand tests that we've run, we're really keen to ensure that we constantly make adjustments to make the test as fair, as reliable, and as replicatable as we can. So our continuous improvement project is looking at barriers to success, what the entry level for training is like, reliability of examiners, amongst other things. The continuous improvement project first report isn't due for another month or so, but there's not going to be any substantive change. We're not going to do a massive sort of accreditation to certification switch, but it will be lots of minor incremental changes to make the test as current as possible, but also make sure that there's none of those barriers in place for candidates. So things that we are looking at that will probably be released, something like the length of time someone is allowed to prepare prior to the interpreting test, and whether they're allowed to have internet resources prior to it. So at the moment, they can, but it's 15 minutes. Do we provide them with a brief 3 days prior so they can do a little bit more research, for example? Another really key area for us, and we're doing a couple of pilot programs at the moment with International Red Cross and Host International, is looking at emerging communities. So probably uncontroversially to say, the profession for interpreters and translators is heavily skewed towards the large languages of the world: Mandarin, Spanish, French, Arabic. But the people that need these interpreting and translating services the most are often from marginalised communities that are having to establish their life after being forcibly relocated in many cases, or fleeing from persecution. And whether that's Rohingya from Myanmar or Tigrinya from Ethiopia, like, there is a real need for them to be able to migrate to a new country, seek refuge, but then also get the services they require in a timely manner. And in Australia, we have an adult migrant education program, which gives up to 500 hours of free tuition to get English proficiency. But by the time that's achieved, they've already been here 6 months to a year, and it's only getting people to vocational use. So what can we do as an organisation to really help get interpreters in early in the languages that are required and accelerate that, that transition to a new life for refugees or migrants into the country? So it's a tricky space. There's lots of their own nuances and challenges that need to happen and be resolved. But we think that's a really key part of our place in Australian society. We definitely need to do more with consumer awareness. So I can't mention it, but even after 45 years, NAATI struggles with that perception that bilingual equals interpreter, and making people aware of that. We did some focus group research just several months ago that still shows that people in health settings particularly, although they know that professional practitioners exist, they still want to use family or friends to interpret for them because they have greater levels of trust. So that's going to be a really large part over the next year for us, of saying you should still have your family or friends as part of that meeting with the doctor with you or in the surgery, but use them for the emotional support and for a bit more conversation about your options, but use the professional interpreter for the tricky stuff, the highly technical language and the things you need to know, because getting the words wrong in that space, it can literally be the matter of life or death. So consumer awareness for us, making people aware that it's out there in Australia. We're great with language access. There's lots of government support to provide it, but it's often not taken up either because people just don't know that it's available. So making it aware, people aware it's available, and making them aware that it can complement family and friends and not replace them is going to be a really key part. And finally, we're keen on research and advocacy. So we currently commit about $250,000 a year into research projects within Australia for the betterment of the industry. We don't see that stopping, we see it growing. There is definitely lots of research in the field in the benefit of interpreters in health settings specifically. There's definitely a lot of research in the literature of refugees and low English proficiency and what low English proficiency means for migrants into English dominant countries. We don't think there's a lot of information that's connecting both of those sides together, and the use of interpreters and translators more broadly in business and other socioeconomic settings. And we can also, I think, do a lot more research into the financial value of interpreters, and that the upfront cost of maybe several $100s can actually save millions of dollars for long-term aversion of health outcomes or business outcomes that would have been avoided if the language was done properly. You know, we find it quite amazing, and probably preaching to the converted on this webinar, no one second guesses the cost that we attribute to information technology providers just to avoid any risk of something going wrong, or a lawyer. We would never question the value of a lawyer, and in fact, we would see that if a lawyer gave a really cheap price, we would think that it was going to be bad quality. But there seems to be this constant race to the bottom for interpreters and translators, where it's seen as an unnecessary expense and one that can really just be avoided, or we can just use Google Translate and that will be okay. And there's certainly been examples in Australia and around the world during COVID of Google Translate or another machine translation engine being used, and the information is just not correct, and that's leading to really perverse outcomes for those groups that need the most help. So that's where we hope to be. So that's probably I don't know what the timing was with that, but thanks for listening. I hope it was interesting and super keen to hear if anyone's got any questions that I can help with. I'll stop sharing my screen.
I can assure you questions you have, they started coming in early, and you actually rate the unusual honor of having the most prioritized questions in terms of the ones that I want to ask you, because we never get through even a fraction typically of the questions that I've ever had. So I'm not going to waste any time, Michael. I'm going to start asking you right away, because people are really curious. And I apologize because I was also busy answering questions if I ask you something that maybe you answered, because that happens too. Do they offer programs in translation and interpreting at the master's and PhD level in Australia?
Yeah, they do. But to give a bit more context to that, so when we introduced formal training as a prerequisite, it has helped, and just like our recertification program requiring PD, it has helped the Australian industry create more courses, which is growing for practitioners. But there is only 16 languages that are taught at a diploma level or higher within Australia. And I'm going to be not even going to quote the figure, but it is significantly less than that at a master's level.
Oh, gosh.
So there is a bit of an imbalance at the moment that we hope sort of starts to address over time. But the minimum training we've got is a skill set of a diploma. It's about 11 weeks, which is able to be done in a language neutral format. We're working with the training regulator here in Australia to try and make a diploma level, so about a year's worth of training in all languages. But we hope that with this certification system over time, that there will be more and more people pushing towards those high-level credentials, and the master's programs, universities, colleges, they're demand-driven as well. So the more people that want these high-level credentials, more people that see it as a profession, hopefully we can do more to get it recognised as a profession, and the rates going up, and then more people will start pushing for masters in those languages.
You complain, but we wish we had your level at our universities, I can tell you. Again, I apologize if I missed this one specifically. Is testing for NAATI free, or do people get charged a fee for taking the test? Did you?
No, they do get charged a fee. So my conversion rates will be rough here, but about $400 for certified translator and certified provisional interpreter tests, and about $600 for our certified interpreter test. Anyone that can do the math on human resources, we don't recover the full cost of testing. So for every single test, there is at least 9 people involved in it, sort of 7 staff and 2 examiners. And that's if there's one candidate. So other business activities and a small amount of government grants help subsidise the cost. But we certainly acknowledge that the cost of the test is still quite prohibitive for people going into the profession.
Yeah. Do you do scholarships at all?
There is some scholarships. They're often offered by state and federal governments.
Thank you. How many people of Aboriginal communities do get certified as interpreters? And there's a second part to that question, but I'll wait for this part.
Yep, it's the overall numbers aren't large. I think at last count we had only around 200 Aboriginal practitioners in about 25 languages, so fluctuates. The other point of that though, so in Australia at the last census, so our last census is in 2021, but the results aren't released. So in 2016, our last census, there was over 600,000 Mandarin speakers within Australia, about 330,000 Arabic speakers, just as context. The largest Aboriginal language in Australia, there's Yumplatok, which is Torres Strait Island Creole, and there's Northern Territory Creole. They both have around 6,000 to 8,000 speakers. And then the largest non-Creole is Jumbapungu, which is from northeast Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, about 6,000 people. And then there's 11 or so that are around the 1,000 to 2,000 speakers mark. And then there's a whole heap that are in the hundreds. So although we don't have many practitioners, that's a really long answer to your short question, sorry. So although we don't have many practitioners, the numbers of speakers in these languages is really quite small.
You have an astounding number compared to the United States, which has more than 10 times your population. I just want to point out to everybody that Australia has a smaller population than my native Canada, which is about 1/10 of the US. So it's still super impressive as far as we're concerned. And the second part of the question was, how many people of Aboriginal communities today do you think are doing remote simultaneous interpreting, RSI?
None. And I could be proven wrong on that, but almost certainly none. We don't have anything above CPI level being tested, and the majority of the interpreting, I'm speaking in generalizations, I'm more than happy for someone in the chat to correct me on this, but it is community level interpreting.
Yeah. Which is, even in the States, that's normally supposed to be consecutive anyway. If it's Q&A, which is and dialogue interpreting in general, it would
be some done in court settings.
There you go. Yes, that would be simultaneous, but not necessarily remote simultaneous.
No,
yeah,
it'd be
got it.
Almost certainly in person.
Almost certainly. I love this question. Would this be considered national certification or international?
If someone wants to adopt us, we'll go anyway. Definitely national for us, and the way that New Zealand's treating it, it's national for them. We've got a couple of, we're getting more and more queries from international governments and universities about what we do, how we do it, why we do it. I think how we got to where we got to, our ownership structure, how long we've been in operation makes it a little bit easier for us. Obviously, starting something like this from scratch is quite challenging. But we would certainly, for the purpose of that question, we would certainly be willing to work with anyone. We see that as part of our commitment to the industry, to work with anyone that's interested in, setting up a system or how we do it for the benefit of society in general.
There is no question that I see tremendous potential for international. So I will be following the future of NAATI with great interest. Someone asks, in professional testing, why live role play dialogues and not recorded? What are the main advantages for live as a test administrator?
Yeah, so the advantage of live is really that, what's the best way to do it? So stuff like interactional management, professional conduct just can't be tested properly with recorded. We do things like during the test, there'll be instances where the role players will drop a pen or mumble and it tests the interpreter's ability to ask for clarification and manage the interaction and the discourse. So that's really the key part of the live. It's certainly more difficult to maintain consistency than pre-recorded, but yeah, we're committed to it. We think it's been a good introduction to the system, and I think it also gives more reliability to the test in that every performance is different. So the script might be roughly the same, but the role players aren't reading from the script. So right at the early part, someone had found a script, one of the candidates, and it was picked up on because they interpreted part of the dialogue that the role player didn't actually say. So,
oh wow!
Yeah, so
they were
the
caught
last part,
cheating.
Yeah, caught. We have tightened up some procedures. That was
red-tongued.
Right at the very start. Yeah, so in that scenario, the candidate actually knew the role player, and the role player leaked the information. So we put up procedures around that. But it does show the advantage of live role play is because even if you've got the script, you can do some rehearsal on it, but you can't prepare for every situation that might arise with it being live. So
every iteration is different. That is fascinating. Is there a website, I know the answer to this one, that explains the interpreting test procedures or gives set examples like the examples you gave?
Yeah. So naati.com.au is the place to go. So we've got
naati.com.eu. Andrew, would you be kind enough to type that in the chat for us? Thank you.
So lots of information on there. Really key though is just in end of last year, we introduced a whole range of practice tests for all our translations, all our interpreting. So obviously we don't have live role players that you can practice with. That would cost me far too much money. But
there you get the recordings.
We've got the recordings on there of how the dialogues work. So we have the role player speak, and then we have the English role player speak, and people can, we invested a fair bit into a learning management system last year. So it gives information about the rubrics, information about the test types, and then also gives those sample dialogues or sample translations that people can practice with, so they can see the quality, context, and complexity of the dialogues.
Absolutely wonderful resource. Encourage everyone to go check it out. I have checked it out. It's impressive. Can an American residing in America get certified there?
Yep, so we'll test anyone anywhere. The time zone might be terrible, just like
but you're here,
getting
so
up early.
You can do it, they can do it.
As I mentioned in the presentation, one of the, for all the horror that COVID has inflicted on the world, for NAATI as a business, it really pushed us into that, being able to deliver online, and that's really opened things up. So about 10 to 15% of our candidates are overseas at the moment. Most of them are translation, but we do the interpreting tests, and every test session that we run from here on in will have at least one online option. So we have face-to-face testing. We've got dedicated test venues around Australia, but we will definitely have an online option for people. And we're right in the final stages of launching a dedicated live test platform as well. So we've got a translation and pre-recorded tests in conjunction with Televic, but the online live stuff we've been using Microsoft Teams or Zoom, but we will have our own dedicated platform in the coming months as well.
That's when we can talk about being really international, right? Last question, how long is the process from initial application through evaluation and receipt of certification?
Yeah, changes a little bit. So where someone has already got formal qualifications, apply with us, they'll be made eligible for testing within 1 week, probably from time of application. And then we run tests from next year. We'll run tests at least every 6 months of every single language. So the most from application to sitting the test, about 6 months. If it's a language like Mandarin, it's a lot shorter. We run those tests more frequently.
Sure.
And then it takes 8 to 10 weeks to get results back. So that seems like a really long time, but we allow for 2 examiners to, so I just did the numbers yesterday. You reckon I'd have it off the top of my head. I think the average is 5.7 weeks for results at the moment. So 2 examiners get the results back to us. We give them sort of 4 to 5 weeks. You know, they're all academics, professionals as well, so give them time to do it properly. But then if it has to go to the 3rd examiner, that adds another 4 to 5 weeks onto the first 2. So that's why we give ourselves 10 weeks. The average is about just over 5 at the moment.
Well, this has been incredible. There's been, of course, a lot of very appreciative comments, not just because you got up early, Michael. And someone wrote, I'm intrigued even by the community language aid training. And she said, especially the clarification of where the CLI role boundaries are. I wanted to hand it off to a full-fledged professional. Some have been comparing it to what goes on in the States. But you've really enriched us by giving us this overview. I personally find it exciting to think that you might go international and maybe you'll spur people in this country. One of our questions that we didn't have time for was, well, what about here in the US? You know, can we do something like this? It's incredibly impressive that you've come so far, even though the population is actually relatively small. You're operating at the scale of a huge country compared to any country I know. So thank you so much for generously sharing your time and experience with us, Michael. And keep us posted, please. We'll be happy to share the stories and the successes of your certification program.
Fantastic. Really appreciate the opportunity to present and always happy to answer questions.
If for those of you who didn't get your question answered, because there were dozens, please feel free to email us at info@cultureandlanguage.net, and we'll be happy to pass questions on to Michael in Australia.
Cool. I'll head off. Thank you so much for the time, everyone.
Have a wonderful rest of your long day.
I might go have a nap.
You might be a good idea. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.